Hello, everybody. Welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Eddie Lewis, and today we're going to be talking about competition in music. It's probably not what you think. Most of us see different musicians stratified from best to worst or worst to best, and we assume that the beginners are worse than the virtuosos, and that most musicians are somewhere in between those extremes, right? So we can say beginners are the worst players, junior high students just above that, high school students just above that, college students, most adult students just above that, touring crew. Now, when I say touring crew, I'm talking about the people who travel with name acts. Um, and then pop artists, we have people like Chris Bodie, who are wonderful musicians, and we just assume that they are better than the people who are in a touring crew. Then we have those trumpet players who stand out as being the best in the world. People like Maurice Andre or Alan Vizzuti and so on. So if we apply that to the chair placement in your band, we can say Johnny is the worst player in the band, then Susan, then Robert, then Henry, then Patricia, then George, Howard, Sylvia, and Kirk is first chair, so he must be the best player in the band, right? Wrong. Today, what we're going to talk about is why that's not correct. In order to understand why it's wrong, you need to know that there are many different aspects of musicianship. When we look at competition in music, we have to take into account things like sound, expression, rhythm, sight reading, dynamics, range, style, phrasing, transposition. All of these things are supposed to be taken into account in a competition in music, right? Now, the problem is that we don't all progress equally in all of those areas at the same time. This is called asynchronous progress. There are some students out there that will progress very easily with their sound, but there are other students that won't. They'll struggle with their sound. Same thing with range. Some will get their range very easy, others have to struggle. Technique, very easy, some will have to struggle. Every aspect of musicianship works like that. We do not progress evenly across all aspects. So let me tell you a little story about two students I had. Let's look at student A. Student A could play all 12 major scales and arpeggios by memory, all 12 minor scales and arpeggios by memory. He was a great sight reader. He could transpose up and down a major second. He had a mature sense of phrasing. He memorized 6+ classical trumpet solos, memorized dozens of jazz tunes, and was a skilled improviser. Student B knew only 5 major scales with no arpeggios. He didn't know his minors yet, only a decent sight reader. He could not transpose. He had crude phrasing. He only had one memorized classical trumpet solo. He had memorized dozens of jazz tunes and was a skilled jazz player. Now, both of these students were the same age. They were both my students at the same time, and they both auditioned for the same contest to get into a certain band. The student who looks like would be a better candidate did not get into that band. Student B, on the other hand, did get into the band. They were competing against each other. Looking at this chart, how can that be possible? Well, look at what aspect is missing on this chart. The aspect of sound. Student A lost because his sound was bad, and student B's sound was a whole bunch better than student A's. Student A was actually a better trumpet player, but student B had a good sound, and that's what pleased the judges. Do you see where we're going with this? Let's take a look at different examples of asynchronous progress. Here's the green player. Horrible sound, okay expression, horrible dynamics, horrible velocity, horrible sight reading. He's got great endurance and pretty good range. Now let's look at the blue player. Blue player has a wonderful sound. His expression is okay, his dynamics are okay, horrible velocity, pretty bad sight reading, just okay on his endurance, and his range is horrible. Okay, so we're looking at someone who can barely play an E in the staff. If it's down that low, that's someone who has no range at all. Now let's look at another player. The red player has not so good sound, not so good expression. Dynamics are okay. Velocity is not so good. Sight reading, excellent. Yeah. And then endurance is not good at all, horrible. Range is medium. Now think about it. Each student has a different makeup like that. You know, when I'm teaching, I'm looking at the students in my head. I have graphs like this, and I can see, and this is, in my opinion, this is an important part of teaching. I see a graph in my head with all the strengths and weaknesses of my student. My job is to help them address those weaknesses so that they come up to be closer to the other strengths. Now, let's take a look and see what happens when we compare just two musicians. We've got blue and green here. Blue has a better sound than green. Blue has a slightly better expression than green. They both have the same dynamics, but in terms of speed, how fast they can play, blue is like extremely much better than green. And then it flips for sight reading. Blue can't sight read very well at all, and green is an excellent sight reader. Then we have endurance. Blue is okay, green is not so good. And then we have range, and blue is not doing so hot with that, and green is just a little bit better. Now tell me, look at that chart and tell me, which of those two is the better player? How are you going to answer a question like that? You're the judge, and you have to put one above the other. Which one are you going to choose? Okay, now we're getting to it. Because doesn't it really come down to the judge's preferences? If you're the judge and you love a beautiful sound, aren't you going to pick blue over green? Let's take a look at this. Judge 1 is a sound is everything judge. Is there such thing as a sound is everything judge? Well, I didn't make this up. I was on a gig one time, and the other trumpet player is someone who commonly judges school contests. And he told me that his strategy when he judges is, if the kid has a good sound, he's in. Basically, what he described to me is a sound is everything approach. So let's take and look at two students. If you have these two players, I'm not going to summarize these, you can see the chart yourself. If we have these two players and a sound is everything judge is judging them, it's obvious that the judge is going to pick the blue player, not the green player, because all he cares about is sound. It doesn't matter that the green player is better at everything else. The green player is not going to win, even though technically speaking, he is a better player. Now let's go look at a range is everything judge. Now, you might think I'm being sarcastic. Certainly, nobody would ever have a judge who is range is everything. You know what? It happens. It may not happen as often as a sound is everything judge, but there are some people out there that all they care about is range. If one of those guys gets a band directing job and ends up a judge, you could do really, really well. Let's take a look at the next chart. Maybe you have a great sound and every other thing that you're doing is better than the green player. We're looking at the blue and green, right? But the green player has the best range. Then obviously that judge is going to pick the green player. Now, you might think that I'm making this up. It's not. There really are some people out there like that. I would like to believe that it's extremely rare for a range is everything judge to ever be a judge at a serious audition, but I've heard rumors. Let's not rule that out, all right? Okay, moving on. Now, I think this third example is a little bit more typical. I think there are, oh, by the way, this one is mine. We're looking at my preferences now. I am Judge 3. I think sound is important, but I don't think sound is nearly as important as expression. I think dynamics are moderately important. I don't care personally how fast you play. I really don't. So I put on this chart velocity at 0. Sight reading, if it is a contest that has sight reading in it, I think that's pretty important. Endurance, I don't care much about that. And range, nah, I don't care about that either. Okay? Of course, it depends on what it is that you're auditioning for. If you're auditioning for the lead spot in a big band, maybe that range figure will go up, but we're not. I'm talking generally right now. I don't really care that much about how high you can play. So in this graph, I'm showing you my preferences. Now, out of these two players, green and blue, which do you think I would put on top in first chair? Well, let's look at it. They both have the same sound. Blue's expression is quite a bit better than green's expression. Green doesn't do so well at dynamics. Green plays very fast. Blue doesn't play fast at all. Green's sight reading isn't so good. And endurance, they both equal on endurance. Green has a better range. What do you think? Which one of these am I going to choose for first chair? Obviously, it's the blue one. Even though the green player can play really high and really fast, that doesn't impress me, and I'm not going to put that person on first chair. So you see, if whatever my preferences are, that's how I'm going to judge. And it would actually be dishonest for me to judge any other way, right? Why would I give someone extra points because they played high if I think playing high is kind of disgusting? You see what I'm saying? Now, there's another thing to take into account. It's not enough to look at what the judge's preferences are in terms of one aspect over the other. That's not enough because sometimes the judges will prefer a specific type of something. In this video, we have only looked at the judge's musical preferences in terms of one aspect of music being more important than the others. There is another dimension you should consider in the context of competitions, and that's the stylistic preferences of the judges. What happens when you audition for a judge that prioritizes sound over everything else? And your sound is your best quality, but you have a different type of sound from what the judge prefers. It is, in that case, quite possible that the judge will favor someone else's performance over yours. This happens with a great deal of things. You know, maybe the judge wants vibrato, but if you're doing a vibrato that the judge doesn't like, it could actually end up hurting your placement in the audition. Maybe the judge likes when you add a little bit of rubato, but if you do the rubato differently from what he would prefer, then it would count against you, not for you. Same expression, all those things. There's a whole bunch of stuff that maybe that's your best quality and that's what the judge prefers, not the way you do it. You know, I had a teacher one time that told me that I had a beautiful sound, but I didn't have the right sound. And he told me this right after he had voted against me in a contest situation. This teacher had voted against me, and he says, you know what, you have a beautiful sound, but you don't have the right sound. Okay, so this is the real world, people. This stuff actually happens. You got to stop thinking that competition is all about the best guy wins. So now we want to ask, since we know this is the way it is, what can you do about it? Well, first of all, the most important thing you can do to win more competitions is you can cover all your bases. It makes a lot more sense to be better at everything than to put all your eggs in one basket. If you have a sound is everything judge and your sound is beautiful, you don't have anything to worry about, except for the preferences that we talked about with the stylistic stuff, right? So right now we're not talking about that. You know, you greatly increase your chance of winning a competition if you are better at everything. Everything. And I encourage you, along those lines, I encourage you to find a list somewhere of all of those different aspects so that you know what has to be. In fact, you can make one of these graphs for yourself, right? And that's why we have here, look at this chart. The red player in this chart is better at everything than the other two players. It's almost impossible for this person to lose, regardless of what the judge's preferences are. You see how that works? So that's what you want to strive for. Secondly, when we have competitions with this, everyone's playing all the same music, we want to cover general stuff over specific stuff. And what that means is your sound is actually more important than whether you get one rhythm right. Okay? Your your sense of time is more important than whether you get the one note right. General stuff over specific. Expression is more important than specific mistakes. And you know what? When you have a competition like that where everyone's playing the same music, then this would most typical we would be talking about like all region band, right? When you're going to all region, this is one of the reasons why you shouldn't freak out if you made a mistake. Because chances are the judges won't even remember your mistake. But what they will remember is that you had a horrible sound. What they will remember is that your tempo was all over the place. What they will remember is that you have clipped cracked notes all the way through the song. Or if you're horribly out of tune, they'll remember that stuff because it's general. It's something that happens all the way through the whole song. Individual mistakes are less important. So we want to emphasize sound, 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 okay? Now, another thing to say for fixed lit competitions is what my last trumpet teacher Dick Schaefer said, he says, your attitude needs to be, we're taking our goods to market. In other words, don't put all your eggs in that one basket. Okay? Don't don't try to win just one competition. Sign up for every competition you can get signed up for, and play the numbers. That's really what it comes down to. The more auditions you sign up for, the greater the chances of you winning. So don't just do region and put all your eggs in that basket. Now, the whole take your goods to market thing, Dick Schaefer told me, he says, when I go to the auditions, back then I was taking orchestra auditions. And I won't go into why I'm not doing that anymore, but there's a legitimate reason for that. So, but we won't go into that right now. But anyway, he said that he pushed an imaginary cart, and he opened up the imaginary cupboard doors, and then he said, "There's your goods." He says, "You take it to the audition. If they want to buy it, sell it to them. If they don't," then he closed those imaginary doors, he went back to the handle, and he pushed his cart to the next audition. And I think that's a wonderful analogy for what our attitude should be when we go to the competitions. This is just one of many. And we have to have that attitude. We have to have the attitude that this one audition isn't as important as we think it is. All right? Also, I want to stress that you should find a good teacher, because without a good teacher, how are you going to know if there's a aspect of your playing that's suffering that could possibly prevent you from winning an audition? You know, one of the problems with learning trumpet on your own is that it's almost impossible to self-evaluate as well as having a teacher evaluate you for you. Okay? So, yes, we want to find a good teacher. And then last, I want to suggest that you adjust your priorities as you advance. So, let's say you don't have a good sound. You make getting a better sound a higher priority. Obviously, we want to do that. But what happens then when you get your sound to a higher level? That means your graph just changed. Your bar graph has just changed. And so now whatever your weakness is something different. Maybe it's triple tongue now. And you want to start working on your triple tongue. Okay, so as you progress, we want you to adjust your priorities so that you begin working on stuff that is going to help. All right. Now, there are competitions where you get to pick the song. When you have those kind of competitions, it's very different. Okay. We want to favor your strengths. You know, a lot of people, when they're signing up for solo contests and they're going to pick a solo, they try to pick a solo that will challenge them, and that's not really the best way to go. If you are really interested in winning, that's not the way to go. All right? You pick a solo that will emphasize your strengths. Pick a solo that has things that you're good at. Look at your chart. Look at your graph, your bar graph. Is sound your best quality? Then pick a solo that will emphasize your great sound, right? If you have wonderful technique, then pick a solo that will emphasize your technique. You know, my son, trumpet is not his first instrument. He's a pianist. And on his graph, his sound, he never had a really, really bad sound, but it never was really all that good either. Okay? But he has a great ear. Oh, I'm talking about when he was in high school. That was about 6 or 7 years ago. And he had a great ear. He had pretty good technique. So I picked for him the Halsey Stevens. He nailed it. Even though his sound wasn't the best sound in the world, he nailed it. and got a 1 on the solo. And that's just the example. I do that with all my students. There was a student that I had also one time who, um, so he's a very talented kid, but his aspects, his strengths and weaknesses were all over the place. He had things he was really good at and things he was not so good at. But one thing he did have going for him was he had a really good range. And there's a solo, I don't remember the name of it right now. I think it was written for, it's a classical solo, but it was written for Doc Severinsen, if I'm not mistaken. And this student, even though he was a freshman in high school, he played that solo and he nailed it. He wasn't really good enough to play a solo of that difficulty, but it just so happened that all of the difficulties of the solo lined up with what he was good at. So yeah, that was a great experience for him, great experience for me too. I really enjoyed seeing him conquer that solo, even though when you look at all of his qualities together and take that into account, he really was not good enough to play a solo like that. I know that sounds weird, right? But that's really how it works with these kinds of competitions. You really can stand out and sound better than you are. All right, also, I really believe when you're playing a solo that you get to pick the music. I think you should strive for musical honesty. And what is musical honesty? Basically, what I'm saying is you need to like everything about your performance. I'm not saying you should like your performance. I'm talking about the style. For example, the vibrato. Don't worry about what the judge is going to prefer. You can't second guess that stuff anyway, right? So instead of going that route, do a vibrato that sounds good to you. Same thing with phrasing and, dynamic nuances and stuff like that. Do what sounds good to you. All right? All right, next. Give the music a personal touch. Make it yours. Take ownership of the piece. Give it a personal touch. Now, obviously, we don't want to break out of the bounds of what's stylistically appropriate. Don't swing a classical piece, for example. That's not what we mean by personal touch. I don't really have time to go into the personal touch thing here, but yes, just in general, we want to add our own little flair to it or whatever. All right? Now, let's summarize what we're talking about here. Competition results are not linear. They never have been. There are many aspects to each performance musicianship, and each musician has a different set of skills and weaknesses. This is due to asynchronous progress, right? Number 4, each judge has different musical preferences. And then 5, judges will most often favor the musicians whose skill sets align with their preferences. And finally, 6, use this information to your advantage. Now, I hope that at this point you're starting to see now competitions in music in a different light. Remember when I said at the very beginning, it's probably not what you think? I bet a whole bunch of you at this point are starting to see the light. It is true that there are some players that stand out above the rest, but it's because they're so good at everything that nobody is going to have anything negative to say about them. And that's where we want to strive to be as musicians, right? Now, what does this mean? Before I close this, what does this mean to the people who don't get top chair? This means that the chair that you end up in is probably not a very good representation of how good you are. If you are out of 100 players, you're number 33. You didn't make the band, but you're number 33. What does that mean? Are you the 33rd best trumpet player in the room? No, obviously not. Once you look at it at competition this way, you understand that where you placed in the band doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't mean anything. Let's go back to that example of the two students I had. The better player did not win. He did not get into the band. So there are biases. A lot of times we say that the audition was rigged, and that's usually, I can't imagine that it's ever really true. But what is true is that there is bias involved, but it's musical bias, and you can't make that go away. You can't have judges that don't have musical bias. The whole reason why they are judges is because they have a musical bias. So going into the competitions, you have to keep this in mind. All right, so that's what I have for you on the competition front. If you have any questions, feel free to ask below. This is the first time we're doing this style of video. And if you like these kind of videos, go ahead and say so in the comments so that we can maybe do some more like this. Other than that, God bless you, and we'll see you on the next video.